Welcome back. I don't know how closely you've been following the situation in Gaza and Israel's attacks on Hamas in Gaza, which has led to so many Palestinians being killed and so many people being forced out of their homes. You can imagine how awful it must be to be in the middle of that bombardment and to think of the doctors at the Al-Shifa hospital who've been told to leave the hospital by Israel, but have 700 patients to care for. Imagine being sort of on the other side, although, of course, there's a lot more than just two sides to all of this. Being in Israel, having a member of your family, for example, being taken hostage by Hamas and you don't know where they are. All of this trauma moves in so many different ways. The SA Society of Psychiatrists is now calling for peace in that area. In fact, they're calling for all sorts of countries to get involved. Dr Sandra Fernandes holds many titles, but one of them is a member of the SA Society of Psychiatrists. Dr Fernandes, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. We've all been watching, I think, with horror on all sides, what's been happening in Gaza, what happened in Israel that started this round of this conflict. This kind of physical damage we can see, what's it doing to people's mental trauma? I mean, people being forced out of their homes, people knowing that tonight in Gaza there'll be more bombs exploding and more bombs being dropped on them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the opportunity of being on this platform. And I just want to also express my extreme horror at what is unfolding before our eyes on a daily basis. And if we have a sense of horror and helplessness and hopelessness and trauma, we can't even imagine what it must be like in the people in Gaza, which are having to go through this on a constant basis. So it's not just that they are being subjected to one particular type of trauma, but we're talking about mega levels of trauma. So I wonder if perhaps I can just explain very briefly that the kind of traumas that people experience when it is systematized and it's ongoing. People experience things like post-traumatic stress disorder and various other levels of severe mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety and heightened levels of suicide rates, etc. And what we've learned from the literature is that the trauma and severe aspects of trauma can actually cause neurobiological changes in the brain. So I'm a neuropsychiatrist and I'm quite interested in neurobiology. And it's important to understand that this kind of trauma actually results in structural changes in the brain, in deep-seated levels of the brain that are involved with emotion and cognitive processes. And these changes actually cause an indelible sort of sensory input in the brain and causes actually changes at a DNA level. So we've learned a lot from the time of the Holocaust, where we learned that epigenetic factors actually caused intergenerational effects on survivors and their children of the Holocaust. And this is kind of what we're looking at the moment. So if you think about in the context of Gaza, because that's what we're talking about, is that half of the population in Gaza are actually children under the age of 15. So they're actually adolescents, and many of them are even younger than adolescents. And these are children whose brains have not developed yet, who are still going through profound developmental changes. And so we're looking at children that are being left with deep psychological scars and that are resulting and will end up resulting in significant long-term psychological effects. I wonder if I can also just quickly highlight that as South Africans, as you would know, we're not totally impervious or that we don't know a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder because we too come from a legacy of apartheid that has also in itself caused indelible psychological trauma, not just at an individual level, but also at a societal level. But if you can imagine the trauma now that these children, the most vulnerable in the community, so we're talking about children, pregnant women, the elderly, those with disabilities, those with intellectual disabilities, those with severe mental illnesses that are being subjected to this barrage of kind of mass killing that's taking place. And so it has profound effects.
So, Dr. Fernandes, I mean, there's a whole, we're not going to have time, unfortunately, now, although you could argue that nothing would be more important than discussing the resonance. You referred to the Holocaust as the first example, what we're seeing now, and then what happened in our society, colonialism and apartheid. But I do want to get to something else that relates to all of this, which is that a lot of what we see in the Middle East, and arguably in South Africa, is a cycle of violence. And I realize in the Middle East we can go back a long way in history here too. But just in recent times, if we just stick with the Middle East for a moment, you see violence, reprisal, violence, reprisal. I'm not going to say who started what. But does that lead to a cycle? People feel trapped, violence becomes the accepted way of doing things, and then they use violence in response. And again, Dr. Fernandes, I mean, it's worth re-mentioning. It happens here too.
Absolutely. So the research has actually shown that with an increasing perception of always feeling under threat yourself, if you're living in a society where you're constantly under threat, not only does it cause significant impact in your own psyche and your own psychology, but also in the society as a whole. And in fact, they've shown in research that societies that feel heightened levels of trauma, and, research has shown that about 80% of people in the Middle East, so that not just doesn't include Gaza, but includes all the countries in the Middle East, have been exposed to significant levels of trauma. And what has been found is that trauma also imposes significant kind of militant policies that take place within at structural and governmental levels. So what we're really looking at is a public health crisis on the individual in regards to their physical public health, other secondary processes such as the diseases that will now start unfolding as a result of not having water and, access to food, but also other developments of other secondary processes that also takes place. So the public health crisis, not just physically, but also public health crisis on an emotional and a kind of psychological and behavioral level that really puts, this kind of population with such difficulties going forward, and especially if you're looking at almost half of the population being children.
Dr. Sandra Fernandes, so much more to talk about. Thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time. Speaking from the SA Society of Psychiatrists. So many resonances, of course, with how we feel about where we are and what's happened in our history.